In the year 270, Rome is gone. The map of the world has been torn into 3 bloody pieces. The emperor, a living god, is now a footstool for the Persian king, and that is not a metaphor. Money is worth less than rubbish. People can burn it to heat their ovens. In 50 years, 26 rulers have risen and fallen, and almost every one of them ended with a knife in the throat. This is the chronicle of how the greatest empire on earth died, yet refused to lie down in its grave. You will witness 50 years of chaos and learn how a man in a golden mask pulled civilization back from the edge of death, only to be repaid with a stab in the back by his closest allies.
Inside the emperor's tent on the Rhine, it did not smell of incense. It smelled of wet wool, old sweat, and unspoken danger. On the throne sat Alexander Severus, Rome's last real hope for a quiet, stable life. He was young, polite, educated, and he genuinely wanted to rule by law. But the generals in headquarters were not looking at him. Their eyes drilled into the woman standing behind his chair. Julia Mamaea, the emperor's mother, did not simply advise him. She ran the empire. Hardened legates, men with more scars than medals, had to wait for a woman to nod before anything moved. For Rome's military machine, this was more than a breach of protocol. It was an insult. When a war council debates tactics and the final word belongs to the commander's mother, respect for authority evaporates instantly. The army hated this rule by women, gripping sword hilts until knuckles turned white.
The breaking point came in the spring of 235. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, looting settlements and burning the harvest. The legions roared with impatience. Soldiers cleaned their armor and sharpened their gladii. They were waiting for the order to attack. For a legionary, war was not only duty, it was the only reliable way to earn. An enemy supply train meant a bonus. Captives meant retirement. And then Alexander made a fatal mistake. He decided to spare lives and simply buy peace. Wagons loaded with Roman gold rolled towards the barbarian camp. The emperor was purchasing calm. The legionaries watched their rightful loot, barbarian treasure, flow out of their own treasury and into enemy hands. In their eyes, Alexander did not just show weakness, he stole their money. Into the emperor's tent walked not enemies, but his own centurions.
The conversation was short. Alexander Severus and his mother were stabbed to death on the spot, without trial, right in the middle of the camp. Standing over the murdered prince, the legions looked around for a new leader and chose the complete opposite of the refined Alexander. They pointed to Maximinus the Thracian. He was a giant of a man, a former shepherd who entered the army through sheer strength. He could barely read, wrote with mistakes, yet could break a horse's jaw with a punch. For the first time in 300 years, the ruler of the world was not approved by the Senate. He was chosen by a crowd of armed men simply because he was the strongest and most brutal among them. The moment Maximinus took the crown, the old Rome died. The legionaries understood something terrifying. The source of power was not in Rome, not in law, and not in the gods. Power was wherever the legions stood. The Senate became empty scenery. Now any commander who could promise soldiers more money could declare himself emperor. The mechanism had been set in motion. From that day, Rome stopped being a state and became a battlefield. Everyone against everyone. If the murder of Alexander Severus was the first warning, the year 238 was a fire alarm that never stopped screaming. History remembers it as the year of the 6 emperors, 6 rulers in 12 months. This was not a political crisis, it was a slaughter. Events moved at insane speed. In Africa, father and son were proclaimed emperors, the Gordians.
An elderly governor and his heir decided their moment had come. They lasted 20 days. The governor of a neighboring province, loyal to Maximinus, crushed their forces. The son died in battle. The father, broken by grief, took his own life. In Rome, the Senate, panicking at news that Maximinus was marching closer, chose 2 more elderly men, Pupienus and Balbinus, but their own guard hated them.
The Praetorian Guard stormed the palace, dragged both into the streets, stripped them, beat them, and hauled their bodies through the city before throwing them into the Tiber. Civil war stopped being an event, it became a way of life. Going out to buy bread and seeing an emperor's corpse in a ditch became normal. This bloody carousel ran on one fuel: money. The title of Augustus went to whoever paid more. The rule became simple. A legion proclaimed its general emperor not because he was the best strategist, but because he promised the fattest donative, a cash handout for taking the throne. Emperors changed so fast the mint could barely strike new portraits. The average reign shrank to 2 or 3 years. The army turned into a machine that sucked the empire dry. The soldiers discovered a brutal truth: replacing rulers was more profitable than stability. A new emperor meant a new bonus.
The old emperor meant delayed pay. To feed this monster, the state had to find resources somewhere, and while the legions enthusiastically butchered each other for the throne, the real disaster unfolded where no one remained, on the frontiers. Garrisons were pulled out in entire cohorts. Troops from the Rhine marched into Italy to install their candidate. Danubian legions moved on Rome to collect what they were owed. Forts emptied. Watchtowers stood without sentries. The border lay open. Barbarians who had feared even looking toward Roman eagles suddenly found the road clear. No arrows from the walls, no patrols. Germans, Goths, Carpi poured into the provinces. Wealthy cities stood defenseless. The looting was enormous, but there was no one to protect the country because the army was busy shaking down the latest temporary ruler for another payout. The financial system, overloaded by these costs, began to crack. There was not enough money for everyone, and the emperors came up with a deadly plan to refill the treasury.
Trapped between greedy legionaries and an empty treasury, the emperors could not raise more taxes, so they took the simplest route. They debased the coinage. At the start of the century, the Roman denarius and its older brother, the Antonianus, were hard currency, trusted from Britain to India. It was honest silver. But with each new coup, the precious metal content fell, at first quietly, 90%, 80%. By mid-century, coins were down to 50% silver, and by the year 270, the Antonianus had become a pitiful copper disc with only 2% silver. The mint used plating. A copper blank was dipped in an acid solution with silver, creating a paper-thin shine. But the coating wore off within a week of use, and a merchant was left holding a dirty copper token. The state officially began paying people with fakes.
Trust in money collapsed instantly. The market responded with brutal inflation. Prices shot into the sky. A sack of wheat that once cost 10 denarii now sold for 1,000. At a certain point, merchants simply stopped accepting coins. Why carry a bag of copper if it would buy nothing tomorrow? Rome's economy, the most complex and developed in the ancient world, slid back into primitive barter. Soldiers were the first to demand pay in goods. Emperors had to collect taxes not in money, but in grain, cloth, leather, and metal, to hand out rations to the legions directly. A vast empire turned into a gigantic warehouse. The hardest hit were the backbone of Roman urban life, the curiales, members of city councils. For centuries, they were responsible for collecting taxes in their towns. Once it was an honor. Now it became a curse. The rules were harsh. If a city failed to deliver the required tax sum, the curiales had to cover the shortfall from their own pockets. When money lost value and trade froze, collecting taxes became impossible. The state came for the curiales and took everything. People sold homes, land, and property to pay the treasury. Thousands of wealthy, energetic citizens were ruined. There was only one way out: escape.
They abandoned their houses in the cities and fled to the countryside, under the protection of great landowners who could fend off tax collectors with private guards. Cities, the centers of classical civilization, began to empty. Libraries, baths, and theaters closed because no one could maintain them. The social fabric tore apart. But even economic collapse seemed small when ships appeared on the horizon from Africa. In their holds was an enemy you could not negotiate with and could not kill with a sword. It came from Ethiopia. At first, people took it for an ordinary seasonal fever. Very quickly, it became clear this was an epidemic striking entire cities and armies. A Roman of the 3rd century saw it as the wrath of the gods. Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, whose name would later be given to this pandemic, left descriptions of the illness: severe fever, crushing weakness, ulcers, and bleeding. People lost strength so quickly they could neither work nor fight. In Rome, at the height of the epidemic, 5,000 people a day were dying. Burials could not keep up. The blow to the army was catastrophic. In crowded military camps, infections spread instantly. Entire legions turned into hospitals. Garrisons died out, leaving forts empty. Taxpayers became fewer and fewer. There was no one left to recruit. In panic, society searched for someone to blame.
Why had the gods turned away from Rome? Emperor Decius found an answer: traitors to the faith, the Christians. They refused to sacrifice to Jupiter and to the emperor, and in Decius's logic, that insulted heaven. An edict unleashed a wave of terror. Every citizen had to make a public sacrifice to the Roman gods and receive an official certificate, a libellus. Those who refused were declared enemies of the state. Mass persecution followed. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Christians were dragged to arenas, tortured, executed. But instead of uniting the empire, it split it even further. Society sank into fear and suspicion. While the authorities spent resources hunting internal enemies and checking sacrifice papers, real enemies reached the gates. The Goths, taking advantage of Rome's weakness, did the impossible.
They were a forest people who had never known the sea, yet they built a fleet. Hundreds of boats entered the Black Sea and the Aegean. Barbarians landed where no one had expected them for centuries. Athens, Corinth, Sparta, jewels of the ancient world, were looted. At Ephesus, they burned one of the 7 wonders, the Temple of Artemis. Marble columns fell as the roof collapsed in fire. The Mediterranean, which Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea, was no longer safe. Barbarian pirates ruled the trade routes, finishing off an economy already on its knees. Rome was beaten, sick, and afraid. But the worst blow was being prepared in the East, where one king's ambition threatened to wipe the empire off the face of the earth. While Rome fought plague, a new power awakened in the East. Parthia, the old rival, fell. In its place rose the Sasanian Empire, young, aggressive, and fanatical. The new Persian king, Shapur I, did not want to merely raid the border. He wanted to drive the Romans out of Asia and restore the frontiers of the ancient Persian Empire. To Shapur, Rome was not a partner. It was an enemy that had to be destroyed. Emperor Valerian gathered an army and marched east. It was a huge force, but it was exhausted by plague and long marches. In the year 260, at the walls of Edessa, the unthinkable happened. The Roman army was surrounded. Supplies ran out. Soldiers died of disease. Valerian, trying to save his men, rode out to negotiate with Shapur. He never came back. For the first time in Roman history, a living emperor was taken prisoner. He did not fall in battle with a sword in hand. He did not take his own life. He surrendered. It shocked the entire ancient world. The god's representative on earth, Augustus, ruler of the world, was now a slave. Valerian's fate became legend. Shapur turned him into a living trophy. Roman and Persian sources differ in details, but the meaning is the same. The humiliation was systematic and public.
The most famous story says Shapur used the Roman emperor's back as a step to mount his horse. Each time the Persian king put his foot in the stirrup, he stepped on the spine of Rome. When Valerian finally died from disgrace and exhaustion, his suffering did not end. His skin was stripped, stuffed with straw, dyed red, and hung in Persia's main temple. Shapur showed it to Roman envoys. "Look, this is your emperor." It was a signal to the world. Rome was no longer invincible.
Rome could be beaten. Rome could be humiliated. Rome could be destroyed. The provinces saw that the center could not protect even its own emperor and understood they would have to save themselves. If Rome could not send legions, they would raise their own. If Rome could not provide an emperor, they would choose their own. The empire began to break apart.
By the year 260, Rome's map was torn apart. Instead of one empire, there were three. This was not a political crisis, it was a national collapse. In the West, people grew tired of waiting to die. Gaul, Britain, and Spain broke away. The general Postumus split these lands off not for glory, but for survival. He created the Gallic Empire, his own version of Rome. It had its own senate, its own consuls, and most importantly, its own army that truly defended the Rhine frontier instead of marching into Italy to fight over power. Provincials supported him. At last, taxes went to defend their homes instead of vanishing in the capital. In the east, another struggle for power began, and at its center stood Zenobia, Queen of Palmyra. She was tougher than any general, a widow, a regent, a ruler.
While Rome licked its wounds, she seized Syria and Palestine under the cover of assistance, and then delivered a deadly blow. She took Egypt. Why was that deadly? Because Egypt was bread. Rome did not grow enough grain, it imported it. Zenobia simply cut the food supply. In Rome, famine began, prices soared, crowds rioted in the streets. Zenobia, in her desert palace, proclaimed herself empress and effectively claimed authority. On the map of the time, the great superpower had shrunk into a miserable fragment: Italy, Africa, and the Balkans. The real Rome was squeezed between a strong West and a rich East. No money, no food, no one listened to the emperor. It looked like Rome's story was over. But in this darkness, a man appeared who decided it was too early to bury the empire. Aurelian stepped onto the stage, and he did not come to negotiate. He came to destroy his enemies.
In the year 270, when Rome seemed doomed, power passed to Lucius Domitius Aurelian. He was not a politician, and not the heir of an ancient noble family. He rose from the bottom, a soldier who slept on the ground, ate from the common pot, and hated theft more than he hated the enemy. Legends followed his discipline. Once he caught a soldier who had stolen a chicken from a local farmer. The punishment was terrifying. Aurelian ordered the guilty man tied between two bent trees, and then had the ropes released. The soldier was torn apart. In an army where half the men were ready to betray for money, only that kind of brutality could restore order. Aurelian spoke one language, force, and he had to use it immediately. War came to Rome's doorstep. The Alemanni, sensing weakness, invaded Italy. The Romans lost the first battle near Placentia.
That evening, panic hit the city. People bricked up doors, hid gold, and waited for the end. The Senate, in horror, offered human sacrifices, begging the gods for mercy. But Aurelian acted. He gathered the remnants of his troops, regrouped, and caught the invaders near Pavia. There he destroyed them completely. The Alemanni were slaughtered. The threat was removed. Yet the emperor understood. The days when the mere name Rome protected the frontiers were over. And he did something that became a monument to his age. He ordered Rome to be enclosed by a wall. For 500 years, Rome had been an open city. It needed no fortifications because its walls were the legions on the Rhine and the Euphrates. Now the empire had shrunk. Building the Aurelian walls was an admission of reality. The capital was no longer safe. It had to lock its gates. With the rear secured and the city wrapped in stone, Aurelian turned his army east. There, in the sands, Zenobia ruled, confident that Rome was too weak to fight.
Aurelian marched east with a reputation for merciless command. Cities in Asia Minor locked their gates at the sight of his banners. And then a story unfolded that shows he could also be flexible. The city of Tyana refused to surrender. Furious, Aurelian declared before the ranks, "I will take this city, and I will not leave alive even a single dog." The legionaries heard it as a promise of total massacre and plunder. The city fell through a traitor. The soldiers, eager for loot, reminded the emperor, "You promised to kill everyone, even the dogs." Aurelian replied, "Correct, kill all the dogs." The legionaries froze, but obeyed. The animals were killed, and the people were spared. No looting, no executions. The rumor spread instantly. You could deal with this emperor. He did not destroy cities that surrendered. It worked better than any siege engine.
Syrian cities began opening their gates on their own, bringing out keys and supplies. Aurelian saved time and strength, pushing forward fast. But near Antioch, at a place called Ime, Palmyra's army awaited him. Their Udardana force was the Clibanarii, heavy cavalry where both rider and horse were fully encased in armor. A frontal strike by that mass crushed everything in its path. Aurelian knew, in a direct clash, his infantry would die. So he used deception. As soon as Zenobia's cavalry charged, Roman light horse began to retreat. The Palmyrines surged in pursuit. It was a trap. The Romans were not running. They were exhausting the enemy. Under the Syrian sun, heavy armor turned into an oven. After several kilometers, Palmyran horses began to collapse from heat and fatigue. Then the Romans turned. The slow, exhausted riders were knocked down and finished on the ground.
The finest army of the East was shattered. Zenobia realized she had lost. She abandoned her capital, Palmyra, and tried to flee to the Persians on a fast camel. She needed only to cross the Euphrates. But Roman detachments moved faster. The queen was captured at the crossing. They brought her to Aurelian. Everyone expected an execution, but the emperor chose otherwise. A living queen in chains was a symbol of victory. He spared her to display her to the people of Rome. Grain shipments to Italy resumed. Eastern separatism was crushed. Aurelian looked west. There, in Gaul, his final opponent was waiting.
Tetricus, emperor of the Gallic Empire, was in a desperate position. His army had stopped obeying long ago. Soldiers demanded money, threatened mutiny, and dictated their will. Tetricus was not a ruler. He was a hostage with a title. He took a step many would call betrayal. He wrote Aurelian a secret letter asking for help. It quoted Virgil, "Unconquered one, rescue me from these troubles." Tetricus asked Aurelian to take power, but spare his life. In the year 274, near Chalons on the Marne, two Roman armies faced each other. Thousands prepared to fight. At the start of the battle, Tetricus did the unthinkable. He left his line and crossed to Aurelian, abandoning his legions. The Gallic soldiers, seeing their emperor flee, did not surrender. They were trapped, nowhere to retreat, an enemy ahead. They chose battle. It became a senseless butchery. Tetricus's men fought with the fury of the condemned, defending not their ruler, but their honor and their lives. Aurelian crushed them. The field was littered with Romans killed by Romans. For Aurelian, it was a useful outcome. The most dangerous and rebellious elements of the Gallic army were wiped out. The empire was whole again. It was time for a triumph. Rome witnessed a procession unlike any in centuries. Elephants and tigers were led through the streets. Captured treasure was carried in wagons. But the greatest spectacle was the captives. Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, walked in golden chains. They were so heavy that servants held them up so she could move. Behind her came Tetricus. Two rulers who had recently divided the world now marched as trophies.
The crowd cheered. Aurelian stood in his chariot and received the honors. He was proclaimed Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. The territory had been gathered back into one, but Aurelian knew military victory was not enough. To prevent the empire from breaking apart again, he needed a single unifying idea. So he chose a religious reform.
Aurelian saw that the old religion no longer held society together. The empire needed one will and one center. He established the state cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. The idea was simple and effective. In the sky, there is one sun that gives life. On earth, there is one emperor who gives law. It built a hard vertical of power, no debates, only obedience. It was a step toward monotheism, designed to strengthen the ruler's authority through divine approval. But religion alone could not calm the streets. Aurelian understood the needs of Rome's plebs. For centuries, people had received grain, which still had to be milled and baked. The emperor changed the system. Instead of grain, the state began distributing baked bread. More than that, the ration now included pork and olive oil. The government took on the duty of feeding citizens with decent food.
It made Aurelian wildly popular with ordinary people. With that support behind him, he attacked the most painful problem: finance. Rome's mint was riddled with corruption. For years, moneyers stole silver, produced poor coinage, and enriched themselves. Aurelian decided to restore order and give money back its value. The response was violent. Officials launched an armed revolt. The treasury official Felicissimus incited the mint workers to rebel. It became real street warfare in Rome, on the Caelian Hill. The rebels armed themselves and fought fiercely. Aurelian had to use the army against his own employees. 7,000 soldiers died. It was an enormous price for fighting corruption, but the emperor won. The revolt was crushed, the ringleaders executed. It seemed Aurelian's power was now limitless. But the very traits that saved Rome, his harshness and refusal to forgive, also planted the seeds of his death. He did not tolerate mistakes, and his inner circle lived in constant fear. In the year 275, Aurelian prepared a campaign against Persia. He wanted to avenge Valerian's humiliation and crush the enemy for good. But inside his own camp, a plot was growing. Officers and officials knew the emperor punished any wrongdoing. Bribery, lies, errors, everything could be paid for with death. Fear tightened around his headquarters. The emperor's secretary, a man named Eros, committed an official offense. Aurelian noticed the lie and threatened punishment. The secretary understood what that meant: execution. Trying to save himself, Eros turned to forgery. He was skilled and could imitate the emperor's handwriting. At night, he wrote a list of officers supposedly condemned to death. He included the most influential generals of the Praetorian Guard and even added his own name to make it look convincing.
In the morning, he showed the document to the officers, claiming he had found it among the emperor's papers. The generals saw their names. They remembered Aurelian's cruelty. They remembered executions and purges. No one doubted the list. Fear for their own lives outweighed loyalty to their oath. They decided to kill the emperor before he killed them. The conspirators ambushed Aurelian in Thrace on the road when he traveled with only a small escort. The man who restored the empire died by the swords of his own commanders. The deception was uncovered quickly. When the generals realized they had been used and that no execution order existed, their rage fell on the secretary. Eros was executed and thrown to wild beasts. Aurelian was buried with honors and deified, but Rome was once again left without a strong leader because of intrigue and fear.
Aurelian ruled for only 5 years. In that short time, he achieved the impossible. He reunited a shattered empire, strengthened the frontiers, and carried out crucial reforms. Without his actions, Rome might have fallen already in the 3rd century, and Europe's history would have taken a different path. The walls he built around the capital still stand as a reminder of that era. He gave the state 2 more centuries of life, but the price of survival was high. Rome lived, but it changed forever. The age of civic freedom ended. Imperial power became absolute and increasingly despotic. Aurelian's reforms paved the way for a new system of rule, the Dominate, where the ruler was no longer first among equals, but master over subjects. The crisis of the 3rd century proved that even from the deepest collapse, there is a way out, if a man of iron will takes the helm. Chaos was defeated, but to survive, Rome had to sacrifice its freedom.